I've been covering the galactic conclave for 11 years. 11 years of sitting in press galleries that smell like recycled ozone and the particular brand of political anxiety that only exists when 37 different species are all trying to pretend they're not afraid of each other. 11 years of watching diplomats smile with their mouths and calculate with their eyes. 11 years of filing reports that most humans back on Earth will never read, because they still can't quite believe we're part of a galactic community. And honestly, some days, neither can I. I've seen a lot of things in those 11 years. I've seen the Crethani delegation walk out of a trade summit because someone served the wrong temperature of water. I've seen the Velhari choir perform at the opening ceremonies, and I'll admit I cried, which was embarrassing because I was sitting next to a Dravak journalist who doesn't have tear ducts and found my reaction deeply confusing. I've seen 3 assassination attempts, all unsuccessful, 2 of them frankly amateurish, and 1 honest-to-God miracle when the Sunborn Compact and the Ash Territories signed a peace accord after 600 years of war. I thought I'd seen everything. Then the Princess of Velarith chose a human mate, and I realized I hadn't seen anything at all. Her name was Thessaly Vaughn. In the Velarith naming tradition, the full royal designation was longer. I won't reproduce it here because it spans 14 syllables and contains sounds that human vocal architecture wasn't really designed to make. But she'd introduced herself to the human contingent as Thessaly, and that name had stuck the way names do when they're given with genuine warmth rather than diplomatic formality. She was the 3rd daughter of the Velarith sovereign court, not the heir, not the second in line, 3rd, which meant she had all the weight of royal expectation without any of the direct political consequence, or so everyone assumed. She was educated, luminous in the particular way that Velarith royals are luminous, bioluminescent patterns running along their collarbone and the backs of their hands, shifting with emotion in colors that humans spent months learning to interpret. She was also, by any reasonable measure across multiple species, staggeringly beautiful. The Crethani trade envoy once accidentally walked into a support pillar while watching her cross the conclave atrium, which was funny but also somewhat diplomatically significant, because he was holding a cup of that very particular water. She was also, apparently, deeply, genuinely, unfashionably in love with a human. His name was Marcus Vane. I knew Marcus. Not well, but in the way you know someone when you've both been embedded in the same diplomatic complex for 2 years, and you end up eating in the same cafeteria at odd hours because neither of you can sleep. He was a member of Earth's Cultural Liaison Corps, not military, not political staff, not the kind of human who carried weapons or made speeches. He was the kind of human who showed up to every cultural event with a notebook, who learned 17 words of Velarith just so he could compliment Thessaly's aunt on her garden, who once spent 4 hours helping a Crethani junior diplomat find his missing ceremonial sash, because the Crethani have extremely complicated feelings about those sashes, and Marcus understood that it mattered. He was 31 years old, medium height. Brown hair that was perpetually slightly too long. He had a small scar on his left chin from a childhood bicycle accident, which he'd told me about once at 2 in the morning over bad cafeteria coffee. He was the kind of person who remembered your name after one introduction, and then asked you about it 3 months later, not in a smooth, politically calculated way, but in a way that made you feel like he'd actually been thinking about you occasionally. He was not, by any standard the galactic conclave used to measure worth, impressive. He wasn't a warrior, he wasn't royalty, he wasn't from a militarily significant species. He had no political office, no ancient lineage, no bioluminescence of his own. What he had was a quiet kind of steadiness that was hard to describe and easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Thessaly Vaughn was paying attention. The rest of the galaxy, unfortunately, was not. The announcement came during the 3rd week of the 14th conclave. It wasn't supposed to be a public announcement. From what I was able to reconstruct later, and I spent considerable time reconstructing it, Thessaly had intended to inform her family privately, in the correct ceremonial sequence, with the proper documentation and the ritual acknowledgement that Velarith custom required for a royal mate bond declaration. She'd been meticulous about the protocol. She'd filled out the forms. She'd prepared the documentation. She'd even engaged a Velarith cultural mediator to help navigate the delicate conversation with her mother, the sovereign's third consort. What she hadn't prepared for was the conclave's communications infrastructure having one of its periodic catastrophic failures at precisely the wrong moment, which routed her private message to her family through 17 public channels simultaneously, including the diplomatic press network, the Galactic News Consortium Relay. And I am not making this up, the menu board for the cafeteria on level 3, which spent approximately 40 minutes displaying Thessaly, VAUN, declares human mate bond intent between the specials and the dessert offerings. I found out at the cafeteria. I had just sat down with what the cafeteria called a chicken sandwich and what I called optimistic protein placement, and then I looked up at the menu board, and then I looked around at the other journalists in the room, and then I pulled out my recorder. It was going to be a long day. The initial response was not what you would call measured. I've covered enough interstellar diplomacy to understand that the galactic conclave has a peculiar relationship with scandal. On the one hand, there's a deep institutional commitment to the appearance of decorum. On the other hand, 37 species packed into a single diplomatic complex for 6 weeks generates a kind of pressure cooker social environment, where gossip travels faster than light-speed communications and lands harder than a Dravek freighter. By the time I reached the press gallery, the story had already been picked up by 14 networks. By the time I filed my first dispatch, it had been picked up by 41. By evening meal, it was the only thing anyone was talking about, and I mean anyone. I overheard a heated discussion about it in 3 languages simultaneously in the corridor outside the diplomat's lounge, which was an impressive feat of multilingual scandal absorption. The conversation, broadly, went like this. Can you believe it? No, most people genuinely couldn't. It wasn't that the concept of cross-species bonding was unheard of. It existed. It was practiced in various forms with varying degrees of social acceptance across different species. The conclave had formal protocols for it. There was a whole subcommittee. But this was different. This was a royal, and not just any royal, a Velarith royal, from a civilization that had been part of the galactic community for over 3,000 years, with one of the oldest noble lineages in the known galaxy, with cultural traditions around mate selection that were so elaborate they had their own academic discipline. And she hadn't chosen a Velarith nobleman. She hadn't chosen a distinguished representative of any of the elder species. She hadn't chosen a war hero or a diplomat or a political ally. She'd chosen a human. A human. One of the species that had been part of the galactic community for, and I am quoting here, from an actual editorial I read that evening from the Crethani Consortium Press, which is the kind of publication that considers itself a paper of record, barely long enough to be considered broken in. That was the kind of thing people were saying. I wrote it down. The mocking started gently, as mockery often does. Jokes first. The kind of jokes that have existed in some form since the first time any civilization developed enough social complexity to have an in-group and an out-group. Jokes about humans and their limitations. Jokes about short lifespans and soft bodies, and the quaint little blue planet that had somehow stumbled into galactic civilization without anyone quite managing to stop it. Jokes about what Thessaly Vaughn could possibly see in a creature that didn't even have bioluminescence. I heard them. I cataloged them. Some of them were clever. Most of them weren't. All of them had the particular edge that humor gets when it's covering something that genuinely frightens the people making the jokes. Because underneath the laughter, and I want you to understand this, because it matters underneath the laughter, there was something else. There was fear. Not the obvious kind, not the kind that shows its face. The Velarith nobility didn't fear humans in any military or political sense. They weren't worried about invasion or conquest or the kind of existential threat that drives species into defensive postures. No, the fear was quieter than that. It was the fear of a hierarchy that has been stable for 3,000 years suddenly encountering a variable it doesn't understand. It was the fear of a princess, a Velarith royal, a bioluminescent jewel of an ancient civilization looking at a soft, unimpressive, short-lived human and saying, "Him. I choose him." That was the thing that didn't compute. If she'd chosen a warrior from the Ashkari clans, they would have understood. If she'd chosen a Velhari nobleman with a distinguished bloodline, they would have nodded and filed the paperwork. Even if she'd chosen someone from one of the newer, less prestigious species, there was a whole social machinery for that kind of thing, a way of making sense of it that preserved the basic architecture of the galaxy's self-image. But Marcus Vane, a human with a notebook and a scar on his chin and a talent for remembering names, that they couldn't file, that scared them in ways they were unwilling to admit. So they laughed instead. The formal mockery, and I use the word formal because that's exactly what it was, began at the Sovereign Court's preliminary response session, which I attended in the press gallery, along with about 60 other correspondents from across the galaxy. The Velarith Sovereign Court had sent 3 representatives to the conclave. The head of the delegation was High Consular Furith Vaughn, Thessaly's uncle, her mother's brother, a man whose bioluminescent patterns had the controlled steadiness of someone who had spent decades learning to feel nothing in public. He was flanked by 2 senior courtiers whose names I won't reproduce here, because they subsequently requested removal from the historical record, which the tribunal granted, which tells you something about how they behaved. High Consular Furith didn't mock his niece directly. He was too practiced a diplomat for that. What he did instead was speak at length about the responsibilities of royal lineage and the importance of mate selection that served the interests of the civilization, and the particular challenges presented by certain choices that might be made by younger members of the family who had not yet fully appreciated the weight of their position. Every word of it was a knife, just a very well-dressed knife. The Crethani envoy, who had less diplomatic restraint, was more direct. At a reception that evening, a semi-formal affair where the drinks were excellent and the conversations were terrible, I heard him tell 2 of his colleagues, in what he clearly believed was a private conversation, but was in fact within range of my recorder, that the Princess Thessaly had apparently decided to descend. That was the word he used. Descend. As if choosing Marcus was a journey downward. As if love was a hierarchy that could be ranked. As if the man who'd spent 4 hours helping someone find a ceremonial sash was somehow less than the people laughing at his existence. I kept recording. Marcus knew what people were saying. I know he knew because I asked him. Not for the story, not then, not yet, but because I'd seen him in the cafeteria the morning after the announcement, and he had the look of someone who'd read everything and was trying to process it and wasn't quite managing. I sat down across from him with my optimistic protein sandwich, and I asked him if he was all right. He looked at me for a moment, not defensively, not with the kind of brittle pride that people put on when they're pretending things don't hurt, just looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said, "I've heard worse," which was probably true, and also not really the point. "Are you worried?" I asked. He thought about it. Genuinely thought, which was characteristic of him. He didn't give you the first answer that came to hand. He gave you the one that was actually true. "Not for me," he said finally. "I'm worried for Thess. This is harder for her than it is for me. She's got more to lose." I wrote that down too. Part 2. The Weight of an Ancient Name. Thessaly Vaughn appeared in public 3 days after the announcement. She'd spent those 3 days, I learned later, in a series of private meetings with her family's representatives, with Velareth cultural mediators, with advisors who came to tell her, in various diplomatic ways, that she was making a catastrophic mistake. She'd listened to all of them. She'd heard everything they had to say. She'd asked questions that were, by all accounts, precise and measured and deeply uncomfortable, the kind of questions that expose the architecture of an argument by refusing to accept its premises. Then she'd gone to the conclave atrium. Alone. No escort, no family representatives, no cultural mediators. Just Thessaly in a formal Velareth court robe, deep indigo, the color that royals wear when they're making statements, with her bioluminescent patterns running in calm, steady gold. Gold means certainty, in Velareth emotional language. I learned that later too. She stood in the atrium, which is a large, glass-domed space at the center of the conclave complex, flooded with filtered light from whatever star the station is orbiting, and she waited. She wasn't holding a speech. She wasn't flanked by a communications team. She just stood there in the middle of the atrium in her court robe and her gold light, and she waited. It took about 4 minutes for the atrium to fill up. When it was full, journalists, diplomats, various species support staff, junior attachés who'd come to see what all the fuss was about, she spoke. Her voice was quiet. That was the first thing that struck every person who later described the moment to me. They all said the same thing. She spoke quietly, not whispering, not performing intimacy, just speaking at a conversational volume that should not, by any acoustic logic, have carried through a room that large. But it did, every word clear and calm. "I know what you're saying," she said. "I know what you think. I know the words being used. I have heard them. I want you to understand that I have heard them, and I am choosing to repeat them here in this space, so that we all know what we are discussing." A pause. The room was very still. "You are saying that my choice is a descent, that I am beneath myself for loving someone you consider beneath you. You are saying that a human is not enough, that he is too soft, too brief, too small, too new. You are saying that I am embarrassing my lineage and my civilization and the ancient name of Vaughn." Another pause. "I want to be clear. I have heard all of this, and I want to be equally clear about what I am going to say in response." The room held its breath. "I am not asking for your approval," she said. "I am not explaining myself to you. I am telling you, as a princess of the Velareth sovereign court, in the formal tradition of public declaration, that Marcus Vane is my chosen, and that any challenge to that choice will be received as a challenge to my right to make it, which is a right that has been held by every member of my bloodline for 3,000 years, and which I have no intention of surrendering because you are uncomfortable." She paused one more time. "You may continue to be uncomfortable," she said. "That is your right, but I suggest you be uncomfortable quietly." Then she turned and walked back the way she'd come, and the atrium just stood there, 30 different species in stunned silence, and I swear to you, I was there. I watched it happen. Her bioluminescent patterns were gold the entire time. Not a flicker of uncertainty, not a tremor. Gold all the way across. I found Marcus afterward, which took some effort because he'd been in a side corridor during the speech, watching through a glass panel rather than from the atrium itself. "Did you know she was going to do that?" I asked. "She told me she was going to say something," he said. "She didn't tell me what." "How do you feel?" He looked at me, and his expression was something I don't have a precise word for. Not awe exactly, not pride exactly. Something that combined both of those things with a kind of tender, bone-deep recognition, like watching someone you love be exactly who you always knew they were. "She's incredible," he said quietly. "It wasn't the kind of thing you put in a news dispatch. But I wrote it down anyway." The response to Thessaly's atrium declaration, split along predictable lines. Humans, particularly the human staff and cultural liaisons embedded throughout the conclave, responded with a kind of fierce, quiet pride. Not aggressive pride, not triumphant pride. The particular human pride that looks like someone standing a little straighter because something they believed in got confirmed in public. I saw it in a dozen faces over the next 2 days. This small adjustment of posture, this tiny recalibration. Other species responded less well. The Velaroth court representatives went very still in a way that meant, in Velaroth body language, something considerably more dangerous than anger. High Consular Fureth sent a diplomatic memo. I obtained a copy through sources I won't identify, to the Sovereign Court on Velaroth Prime, detailing the situation and recommending that the family consider invoking the Mate Bond Review Protocol, which was an archaic Velaroth legal mechanism that allowed the extended family to formally contest a royal mate selection on grounds of civilizational interest. The memo was clinical and carefully worded and utterly brutal. The Crethani response was more public. Their consortium press ran a piece, which I read and which I'm choosing not to quote at length out of a disinclination to give it more circulation than it's already received, that questioned, at considerable length, whether the Velaroth royal family had sufficient oversight mechanisms to prevent instability in its younger members, and whether Thessaly's choice represented a concerning pattern in human-aligned diplomatic circles. The phrase human-aligned was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The Velhari, who have a long and complicated relationship with the Velaroth, and who have their own extensive opinions about royal mate selection, issued a formal statement expressing concern and hope for wisdom, which is Velhari diplomatic language for something considerably stronger. Everyone in their own way was applying pressure. The Mate Bond Review Protocol was invoked 7 days after the Atrium Declaration. I received the official notification through the tribunal press system at 3:47 station time, which meant I was reading it in the cafeteria with terrible coffee and the kind of tired, alert focus that breaking news produces in journalists who have been doing this long enough to sleep light. The notification was formal and dense with legal language, but the core of it was simple. The Velaroth Sovereign Court's Extended Family Council had formally contested Thessaly Vaughan's declared mate bond with Marcus Vane on grounds of civilizational interest. The protocol, as I understood it, and I spent the next 4 hours making sure I understood it correctly, required a formal review hearing, which would assess the mate bond against 17 specific criteria that the ancient Velaroth legal scholars had determined were relevant to royal partner selection. If the bond failed to meet the criteria, the court could formally dissolve it. Not prevent it. The Velaroth legal tradition didn't permit actual prohibition of a bond that had been freely declared, but dissolve the formal recognition, which in practical terms meant stripping it of its royal status and all associated protections. In very practical terms, if the protocol succeeded, Thessaly could still be with Marcus, but she would no longer be a princess of Velaroth while she was. That was the knife they'd found, not a prohibition, a choice, him or the title. Marcus found me before I filed my dispatch about the protocol. He came to the press gallery, which is unusual, journalists' workspace being generally treated as exclusive territory by the diplomatic community, and knocked on the glass partition, which is the agreed courtesy signal. I let him in. He sat down across from me in the chair that usually holds my equipment, and looked at me with that particular steadiness of his. "You know about the protocol," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Just got the official notification," I said. "Were you expecting it?" "Thess told me it was possible." He paused. "She told me everything, all 17 criteria, what each one means, what they'd be assessing. And—" he looked at his hands for a moment. "She told me she wants to fight it, full hearing. She wants to stand up in front of the review council and argue her case. That's her right under the protocol, I said. Yeah, he looked up. She also told me what would happen if she loses, what she'd lose. The room was quiet. The ambient hum of the press gallery equipment, the distant sound of the station's air circulation, nothing else. She shouldn't have to choose, he said, very quietly, not with anger, with the particular ache of someone who understands that the world is not always structured around what should be. No, I agreed, she shouldn't. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I need to ask you something off the record. Okay. Do they ever actually win, people who fight the protocol? I thought about the research I'd done in the past 4 hours. The Mate Bond review protocol had been invoked 12 times in Velarith history. 11 of those cases had resulted in formal dissolution. The 12th had been 300 years ago, and the circumstances were so different as to be practically irrelevant. Rarely, I said, because I'm a journalist, not a liar. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that. Okay, he said. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and left the press gallery. I watched him go. Then I turned back to my dispatch, and I sat there for a long moment before I started typing, because journalism is about truth, but it is not always about easy truth, and sometimes you need a minute. Part 3, the 17 criteria. The review hearing was scheduled for the 21st day of the conclave. It would be held in the conclave's formal chamber, the large, high-ceilinged space used for major proceedings, with tiered seating and an acoustic system that made sure every word reached every corner. The review council would consist of 7 senior Velarith court members, 3 of whom were on the extended family council that had invoked the protocol, which is a conflict of interest that I noted in my dispatch, and which the Velarith legal representatives informed me was customary and appropriate, which is the diplomatic way of saying, we know, and we don't care. The hearing was open to the press. This was actually required under the protocol. One of the ancient legal scholars had apparently believed very strongly in public accountability, which was admirable of them and extremely useful for me. I arrived early. Most of the press corps did. By the time the hearing opened, the press gallery was packed, and so was the public gallery above it, and so were the standing spaces along the chamber's sides. 37 species, or at least representatives of most of them, had come to watch. The air in the chamber was the kind of air that happens when a lot of different species with a lot of different atmospheric preferences are all in the same space at the same time. The recycling system was working hard. It smelled like ozone and nerves, and the particular metallic tang that Crethani exhalation produces, which I've always found slightly alarming. Thessaly entered with 3 Velarith cultural mediators and 1 legal advocate, a woman named Saren Cho, who was one of the 7 humans currently certified in Velarith interspecies legal practice, and who had a reputation that I want to describe accurately. She was the kind of advocate who won cases that should not, by any reasonable assessment of the odds, be winnable. She was also, I noticed, extremely calm. Marcus was in the gallery. Not seated with Thessaly, the protocol didn't permit the contested mate to be present at the advocacy table. He sat 3 rows behind the Velarith representatives, which meant he was effectively watching the people who wanted to unmake his relationship sit in front of him and argue their case. I watched him watch them. His face was very still. The council convened. The chief counselor, a senior Velarith court member with bioluminescent patterns in the precise, controlled silver that indicates formal judicial authority, opened the proceedings with a recitation of the protocol's history and purpose. Then the 17 criteria began. I'm not going to take you through all 17 in exhaustive detail. I have the full transcripts, they're part of the tribunal archive, publicly available, and if you want the complete procedural record, you can access them. What I'm going to tell you is the shape of it, what it felt like to sit in that room and watch it happen. The criteria were ancient. 3,000 years of Velareth history had accumulated around them, layer upon layer of interpretation and precedent, and the specific kind of institutional weight that comes from a civilization that takes its traditions very, very seriously. They had been designed, at their creation, to protect the royal family from politically motivated mating, to prevent arranged alliances that served noble houses at the expense of the individuals involved. They were, in their original intent, actually rather noble. What they had become, over 3,000 years, was something more complex. Criterion 1. Does the proposed mate demonstrate sustained commitment to the welfare of the bonded individual? The council's advocate presented evidence that Marcus had no formal binding commitments, no legal standing in Velareth law, no documented history of partnership responsibilities. Sarancho presented the record of 2 years of consistent, documented support Marcus's cultural liaison files, which included the hours he'd spent learning Velareth language and custom, the communications logs that showed the frequency and depth of his correspondence with Thessaly, the testimonials from no fewer than 14 Velareth staff members at the conclave who had observed him over that period. Criterion 2. Does the proposed mate demonstrate resilience sufficient to withstand the pressures of royal life? The council's advocate argued that humans, as a species, had demonstrated insufficient resilience in the face of galactic-scale challenges. Sarancho noted that humans had achieved interstellar travel within 300 years of their first powered flight, had negotiated membership in the galactic community, without military conflict in an era when most new species had required at least 2 significant wars to achieve the same, and had managed to maintain their cultural identity intact through a period of contact that had historically, for many species, resulted in complete social dissolution. She then noted, specifically, that Marcus Vane had maintained his professional composure, his personal integrity, and his commitment to his work for 3 weeks while being publicly mocked by representatives of 37 galactic civilizations. The chamber was quiet during that last point. Criterion 3 was about lineage. Criterion 4 was about physical compatibility. Criterion 5 was about cultural integration capacity. Each one was a blade, carefully constructed over 3,000 years, and the council's advocate wielded each one with practiced precision. And Sarancho answered each one. Not easily, she was working for every point and it showed, but she answered them, methodically, with evidence and precedent, and the particular ferocity of someone who had studied very hard for something that genuinely mattered. We broke at midday. I grabbed food from a corridor station, something that claimed to be a flatbread and mostly succeeded, and ate it standing up in the press area while reviewing my notes and watching the other journalists do the same. A Velhari correspondent I'd worked alongside before, a gentle being named Thressa who communicated primarily through color pattern shifts and had a translation device that was, charitably, approximate, made the gesture at me that means something like, "How do you assess this?" Honestly, I said, "I don't know." Which was true. Sarancho was doing remarkable work. But the criteria were stacked, and the council was not impartial, and the historical record was not encouraging. Thressa made another gesture. The translation device rendered it as, "The human is very still." I looked across the corridor to where Marcus was standing, also eating something, also reviewing something on his personal device. He was very still. The stillness of someone who is holding themselves carefully because falling apart is not an option right now. "Yeah," I said, "he is." The afternoon session opened with criteria 12 through 17, which were the heavy ones, the ones the council's advocate had clearly been building toward. Criterion 12 concerned the capacity of the proposed mate to protect and represent the interests of the bonded royal in contexts of conflict. This was, historically, the criterion invoked to exclude weak or politically inconsequential partners. The strength criterion in the common shorthand, which sounds crude but is more nuanced than it appears. It's not purely physical. It encompasses political influence, social standing, the ability to navigate hostile environments, the resources available to defend and support. By almost any conventional measure, Marcus Vane failed this criterion. The Council's advocate laid it out with devastating efficiency. No formal rank, no military designation, no political office, no financial assets beyond a cultural liaison salary. No recognized standing in any galactic governance structure. No weapons training on record. No combat designation. A member of a species that had been part of the galactic community for decades, not centuries, not millennia. A species that was, in galactic terms, barely an adolescent. The chamber was quiet in a particular way during this presentation, the kind of quiet that feels like agreement. I watched Thessaly's face during the criterion presentation. Her bioluminescent patterns were very controlled, the muted amber that means careful, deliberate emotional regulation. She was listening. She was still. She was not looking at Marcus. I looked at Marcus, he was looking at her. Saren Cho stood up for Criterion 12, and I noticed something. She didn't start with evidence. She started with a question. "Would the council permit me to call a witness?" she asked. There was a brief procedural discussion. Witnesses during review hearings were unusual but not prohibited. The chief counselor conferred with the other 6. After a moment, the request was granted. The witness was a name I didn't recognize. Commander Verith Ash, Crethani Independent Security Corps, retired. She walked in Crethani, which means she was large, blue-gray, and moved with the particular economy of motion that the Crethani security forces cultivate as a professional habit, and she took the testimony position at the front of the chamber. Saren Cho asked her a single question. "Commander Ash, did you, in the course of your professional duties, have occasion to observe Marcus Vane during a security incident that occurred on the 7th day of this conclave?" The commander looked at Marcus briefly. Then she said, "Yes." "Would you describe what you observed?" "I did not know about the 7th-day incident. I want to make that clear because it matters. I am a journalist who was embedded in this conclave complex, and I did not know this had happened. It had not been reported. It had been classified at the time as a routine security matter. It had not appeared in any of the incident logs that the press corps had access to. I found out about it in the same moment as everyone else in that chamber, sitting in the press gallery, recorder running, watching Commander Verith Ash speak. On the 7th day of the conclave, at approximately 2100 station time, a diplomatic reception on Level 2 had been targeted by a Faction 9 operative. Faction 9 being the militant arm of a political movement that opposed human inclusion in the galactic community, and which had been responsible for 3 previous incidents of varying severity over the past decade. The operative had been trying to reach Thessaly Vaughn. The stated aim, which Saren Cho presented in a sealed document to the Council, was not assassination. It was abduction. Specifically, the abduction of Thessaly, to be used as leverage in a political demand targeting the Velareth Sovereign Court's position on human inclusion treaty provisions. The operative had gotten very close. The security perimeter had been breached using forged credentials. The operative had been within 30 meters of the princess when the situation changed. The situation changed because Marcus Vane had been standing between the operative and Thessaly. Commander Ash described it in the flat, factual language of security professionals. Marcus had been at the reception in his official capacity as cultural liaison. He was not armed. He had no security designation. He had, however, noticed the operative before the security team did, noticing the specific details that didn't fit, the angle of approach, the way the credentials were held, the particular quality of attention that someone pays to a room when they're mapping it rather than enjoying it. He'd interposed himself, physically, without a weapon, without backup, without any reasonable expectation that it would go well. He stayed between the operative and the princess for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, Commander Ash said. In that time, he deflected 2 physical attempts to go around him, communicated the situation to our team via a personal device using a frequency he'd apparently memorized from the Conclave's emergency protocols documentation, and maintained sufficient composure to prevent the princess from realizing the severity of the situation until our team could arrive. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Without a weapon, without training, without rank, without any of the conventional markers of someone who does that kind of thing. He was not unafraid, Commander Ash said. I want to be clear about that. He was visibly frightened. His hands were not steady, but he did not move. The chamber was very quiet. In my professional assessment, she said, this represents exactly the kind of resilience and protective capacity that Criterion 12 is designed to identify. He didn't have the tools we train for. He used what he had. The princess was not harmed. She paused. Then, in a voice that was still professionally flat but had something in it that wasn't flatness, she added, for what it is worth, and I understand it may not be worth much in this forum, I have worked security details for galactic diplomacy for 22 years. I have worked alongside beings from 40 species. What Marcus Vane did on the 7th day of this conclave was not nothing. I would say so anywhere. I looked at Marcus during Commander Ash's testimony. He was looking at his hands. The hands that had apparently not been steady for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, while he stood between someone he loved and something that wanted to hurt her. Thessaly was looking at him. Her bioluminescent patterns had shifted. Not gold, something I didn't recognize at first, something I had to look up in the guide I kept on my recorder. When I found it, my throat did something tight and complicated. The color that Thessaly's patterns had become was the deep, particular rose gold that the guide described as the color of a Velorith's recognition of a bond that has already proven itself. It doesn't have a human equivalent exactly. The closest thing I can describe it as is the way you look at someone when you realize you already knew, before you had words for it, that they were worth everything. She already knew. She'd known since the 7th day. The hearing continued through criteria 13, 14, 15, 16. Each one, Saren Cho answered. The chamber's atmosphere had shifted subtly, the way atmospheres in large rooms do when something has been said that can't be unsaid. The council's advocate was still presenting his case, still methodically working through the criteria, but the shape of the room had changed. Something had happened to the air. Criterion 17 was the last, and by historical precedent, the most important. Does the proposed bond serve the long-term flourishing of the bonded individual, and through her, the civilization she represents? It was a broad criterion. It was a deliberately broad criterion, built to give the council maximum latitude. It was the criterion that had ended 11 of the 12 previous challenges, because it was so wide and the council's interpretation of civilizational flourishing so thoroughly aligned with conventional notions of appropriate partnership that challenging it was like arguing against gravity. The council's advocate rose for Criterion 17. He spoke for 21 minutes. It was technically a brilliant argument. I noted it in my dispatch. It moved from the individual to the civilizational with practiced ease. It invoked 3,000 years of Velorith precedent. It painted a picture of the galaxy's social order as a delicate, interlocking structure that benefited everyone, including, he carefully noted, humans, and it argued that disrupting that structure through a royal bonding that violated established expectations would create instabilities whose consequences no one could fully predict. He was not entirely wrong about some of it. The social structures were real. The history was real. The consequences of disruption were genuinely uncertain. But when Sarin Cho stood up for the respondents' presentation on Criterion 17, she didn't argue against the history or dispute the social structures. She said, "The Council has asked whether this bond serves the long-term flourishing of Princess Thessaly Vaughn. I would like to call one more witness." Thessaly Vaughn stood up. She walked to the testimony position at the front of the chamber. She stood there in her court robe, in her gold bioluminescence, and she looked at the 7 members of the Review Council, and she said, "I have listened to this proceeding with full attention and without interruption. I have heard everything that has been said about Marcus Vane, about humans, about my choice, and about what you believe my civilization requires of me." A pause. "I want to answer Criterion 17 directly. You have asked whether this bond serves my long-term flourishing. Here is my answer." Her patterns shifted through something complex, something I didn't have the vocabulary to read, before settling back to gold. "I have been a princess of Velarith my entire life. I know what that means. I know the weight of it and the beauty of it and the cost of it. I am not choosing Marcus Vane in ignorance of what I am or what I carry. I am choosing him in full knowledge of it." She stopped. "He watched over me when I didn't know I needed watching over. He stood in front of something that could have hurt me, with nothing but himself, because that was what was available, and because I was worth that to him. He learned my language because he wanted to understand me, not to impress me. He has listened to weeks of contempt directed at him from 30 civilizations with more practice at contempt than he has at endurance, and he has not become bitter, and he has not become small, and he has not asked me to choose between him and anything else." Another pause. Her voice had stayed quiet the whole time, conversationally quiet, the kind of quiet that carries. "I am asking you, which of those things does not serve my flourishing? Name it. I am listening." The council did not answer. "I choose him," she said, "not because I don't understand the weight of my name, because I do. Because the weight of my name deserves someone who will stand in front of it when it needs protecting, without weapons, with trembling hands, for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and not once consider moving." She walked back to her seat. The chamber was the quietest I have ever heard a room with that many beings in it. Part 4: Blood on the Throne. The council recessed for deliberation. Recesses in review hearings, historically, lasted between 2 and 6 hours. The council went into deliberation at 1647 station time. By 1900, they had not returned. By 2100, the press gallery was getting restless. By 2300, the restlessness had become a particular, charged kind of waiting that I recognized from a handful of moments in my career. The kind of waiting that happens when something is taking longer than it should, and everyone knows it but no one wants to say it, because saying it makes it real. I filed 3 interim dispatches during the recess. I ate a flatbread. I talked to Thressa, the Velhari correspondent, who was unusually animated and whose translation device was rendering her color shifts as things like unprecedented and something shifts, and at one point the tide does not return to where it began, which I found either profound or cryptic depending on the hour. Marcus was in the gallery the whole time. He didn't leave. He sat with the particular patience of someone who has decided that endurance is the only tool available to him, and he's going to use it. At 31 station time, the council returned. The chief counselor's patterns were difficult to read. They'd gone to a careful, controlled neutral silver that communicated almost nothing. The other 6 council members' patterns were similarly controlled. Whatever had happened in the deliberation room was not being broadcast. The chamber was completely full. The overflow gallery was completely full. I don't know if every conclave session had ever generated this density of attendance, but this one had. The chief counselor did not speak for a moment after returning to his seat. He looked at the chamber, all of it. Slowly, the way you look at something you want to remember. Then he looked at Thessaly, then, briefly, at Marcus. "The council has deliberated," he said. "We are required by the protocol to deliver our assessment of each of the 17 criteria before rendering the final determination." Which meant we were going to hear all 17 again. I set my recorder to enhanced mode. Criterion 1. The council assessed that Marcus Vane had demonstrated sustained commitment to the welfare of the bonded individual. Satisfied. I don't think anyone in the press gallery breathed during that word. Criterion 2. Resilience. Satisfied. Criterion 3. Lineage compatibility. This one was complicated. The council noted the significant lineage differential, but found that the protocol's lineage criterion addressed compatibility of values rather than equivalence of heritage. They cited, to my considerable surprise, a precedent from the 2nd century of Velarith history, in which a princess had bonded with a member of a non-noble family on grounds of demonstrated character alignment. Satisfied. The press gallery was very still. Criteria 4 through 11 went in rapid sequence. Some were satisfied with clear reasoning. 2 were satisfied with noted reservations. None were determined insufficient. Criterion 12. Protection capacity. The chief counselor paused here. "The council has deliberated at length on Criterion 12, he said. "The conventional assessment would weigh formal martial designation, political standing, and institutional resources. By those measures, the proposed mate does not meet the criterion." The chamber tensed. "However," the chief counselor said, "the protocol's founding intent was not to identify formal designation. It was to identify the quality that designation is meant to represent. The council, in reviewing Commander Ash's testimony and the documented record of the seventh-day incident, has determined that what was demonstrated on that evening was not a failure to meet the criterion. It was the criterion. The criterion exists to ask, will this being protect what matters? The answer in this case has already been given, in practice, under conditions that no formal training guarantees. The council cannot, in good conscience, determine that a being who has already met the criterion in practice fails to meet it in theory." Satisfied. Someone in the public gallery made a sound, just one person, a small, involuntary sound, but it traveled. Criteria 13 through 16, one by one satisfied. Criterion 17. The chief counselor stopped again, the kind of stop that has weight in it. Criterion 17, he said, the long-term flourishing of the individual and through her, the civilization. A pause. Princess Thessaly Vaughn spoke to this criterion in her testimony. The council has given that testimony extensive consideration. We note that the princess is not naive about the implications of her choice. We note that she understands her lineage and her responsibilities with a clarity that speaks well of her preparation and her character. We note that her characterization of the proposed mate's qualities was specific, evidenced, and persuasive. Another pause. We also note, the chief counselor said, and something in his voice had shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the quiet way that something shifts when a person in authority decides to speak plainly, that this council was convened to protect the princess's flourishing. If we determine that a bond she has freely, clearly, and publicly declared, a bond she can demonstrate is genuine, reciprocal, and already proven under conditions of real consequence, does not serve her flourishing, we are not protecting her. We are substituting our judgment for hers about her own life. The protocol was created to prevent the imposition of unwanted bonds on royal family members. We would be using it to impose the dissolution of a wanted bond. That is not protection. That is its opposite. The chief counselor placed his hands on the table. Criterion 17, he said, satisfied. The formal determination took 30 seconds. The council rose. The chief counselor spoke the words of the mate bond formal recognition, words I had never heard in person before, words from 3,000 years of Velarith legal tradition, words that mean something I can only approximately translate as, "This bond is seen and witnessed and held by the name of this people." Thessaly's patterns went gold. Full, deep, unwavering gold. Across the chamber, Marcus Vane put his face in his hands. Not from grief, from the particular physical necessity that exists when something you have been holding very carefully for a very long time is suddenly allowed to put itself down. I know because I asked him later. I always ask. "Were you scared?" I said. "The whole time," he said, "every single minute." "What did you feel when the determination came?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like I could breathe," he said. "Like I hadn't really breathed in 3 weeks and I finally could." The gallery erupted. Not uniformly, not all at once. It started somewhere in the human section of the public gallery and rippled outward, the way sound travels in a large space, unevenly, differently absorbed by different materials, arriving at different points with different intensities. By the time it reached the far ends of the chamber, it had become something complicated. Not pure joy, not pure anything, but the messy, multi-species, multi-frequency sound of a lot of different beings processing something that was larger than they'd expected. I was recording everything. That's my job. But I was also sitting in the press gallery thinking about the 7th day, and 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and trembling hands that didn't move, and a color of bioluminescence that I had to look up in a guide but that I understood, once I found it, instantly and completely. The deep rose gold. The color of a bond that has already proven itself. She'd known on the 7th day. She'd known before the protocol, before the hearing, before all 17 criteria and the council deliberation and the unwavering gold across a crowded atrium. She'd known when she saw him stand there. High Consular Fureth left the chamber before the gallery noise had fully subsided. I noted that in my dispatch. I noted it without editorial comment, which is one of the disciplines of journalism. You note what happens and you let the reader supply the appropriate feeling. The 2 senior courtiers whose names are now absent from the historical record also left. The council's advocate gathered his documentation with the careful, methodical movements of a professional who has prepared for a loss even while arguing against it. The chamber itself took a long time to clear. People stood in small clusters, talking in multiple languages and non-verbal registers, the way people do after something they weren't sure they'd see and then saw. Thressa found me on the way out and made several rapid gestures. The translation device said, "The tide does not return, and then the shore is different now and then." Clearly, the device was struggling because it produced the phrase "feathers in water," which I don't think was quite what she meant, but which I wrote down anyway because sometimes the translation failure is its own kind of truth. Part 5. What remained? I interviewed Marcus Vane properly 3 days after the determination. He'd requested the interview, which surprised me. In my experience, people who have been through what he'd been through usually want to be left alone for a while. He came to the press gallery and sat in the same chair as before, but this time his posture was different. Not relaxed, exactly, but something like the difference between a person bracing against a wind that stopped and a person just standing. "Why did you want to talk?" I asked. "Because you were there for all of it," he said, "and I thought someone should say on the record what actually happened, not the official version, the actual version." "Tell me," I said. He thought for a moment. "People keep asking me if I was brave," he said, "on the 7th day, and the answer is no, I wasn't brave. Brave is when you're not afraid. I was terrified. I was so scared my hands were shaking, and my brain was doing that thing where it goes very quiet because it's too busy being scared to have actual thoughts." "Then why didn't you move?" He looked at me. Because she was behind me, he said. It's not more complicated than that. She was behind me, and moving would have meant not being between her and the thing that was coming, and that just wasn't an option. So I stayed. It wasn't bravery. It was just she was behind me. I wrote that down. I wrote it down exactly as he said it, in the order he said it, with the pauses. What about everything else? I asked. The protocol, the criteria, everything people said about you. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that, he said. About what it means that this was even a question. That a whole civilization's legal system had to convene and deliberate and go through 17 criteria to determine whether I was. He stopped, started again. I understand why the protocol exists. I don't think it's a bad system in its original intent. But when it's being used to measure someone's worth based on what species they are and what rank they have and whether they glow in the right colors. Another stop. That's not what the criteria are measuring. That's something else. What's it measuring? Fear, he said. It's measuring whether you're like them, whether you're familiar, whether you fit into the categories they already understand. And when you don't, when you're something they haven't processed yet, they call it a deficiency. They call it a descending. They call it wrong. He looked at the recorder. It's not wrong, it's just new. I interviewed Thessaly once briefly, before she left the conclave. She was preparing to travel back to Velarith Prime, not to face official censure, because the protocol's determination meant the formal legal process was concluded, but to have the conversations with her family that couldn't happen through intermediaries and hadn't happened yet. She'd told Marcus it would take some time. He'd said he understood and would be there when she came back, and she'd held his face in her hands, and her patterns had done something in the rose gold that I didn't try to document because some things aren't for recording. She sat with me for 20 minutes. What do you want people to know? I asked. She thought about it. I want them to know that I knew what I was doing, she said. Not just in the legal sense. I want them to know that I looked at Marcus and I saw someone. Not a species. Not a diplomatic category. Not a set of criteria. A person who showed up every day as himself, without apology, without performance. Someone who learned my language not because it was required, but because he wanted to know me more completely. Someone who, she paused. Someone who stood in front of what was coming with nothing, because nothing was what he had, and it was going to have to be enough. She looked at her hands. The patterns there were warm, quiet gold. It was enough, she said. It always was. The conclave concluded 5 days later. The formal record of the Mate Bond review proceeding was entered into the Galactic Tribunal archive under case file GTA 7741 Sovereign, which is the file from which this account is drawn. The 17 criterion assessments, Commander Ash's testimony, Thessaly's statement, all of it is there, publicly accessible, for anyone who wants to read the actual thing rather than the summary version that made the rounds on the news networks. The summary version, for those who encountered it, described the determination as a landmark ruling with significant implications for cross-species bonding law, which is accurate as far as it goes. It doesn't go very far. What actually happened was not primarily a legal event. The legal event was the frame around it. What actually happened was smaller than that and larger. A woman chose someone, and everyone told her she was wrong, and she said, "Watch me." And a man stood between her and something frightening, with nothing but himself and the decision that she was behind him, and that was what mattered. And when the shaking was over and the thing was resolved and someone told him he was brave, he said, "No, I was just there." The blood on the throne. You've probably been waiting for that. It's in the title. Let me tell you about it. On the last night of the conclave, there was a formal banquet. All delegations. Full diplomatic dress. The kind of event where the protocol for who stands where and who is served first, and who sits nearest the center dais takes longer to execute than most military operations. Thessaly was given a place of honor at the Velarith table. So, for the first time at any formal conclave event, was Marcus. This was itself a statement. The Velarith court representatives had not objected, because they couldn't, because the protocol's determination was binding and formal, and the ancient legal scholars who'd built the system had built it to mean something. Partway through the banquet, a serving malfunction, one of the automated food delivery systems, which the conclave complex used throughout its catering operations, malfunctioned at the wrong moment, releasing a high-pressure stream of what was supposed to be a ceremonial Velarith beverage across the central area of the banquet space. The beverage was a deep, translucent red, a very particular shade of red. It covered, among other surfaces, the ceremonial throne chair at the head of the Velarith table, where the High Consular was seated. The High Consular was not injured. The malfunction was contained within 30 seconds by the service staff. The damage was cosmetic. But for those 30 seconds, what everyone in the banquet hall saw was the deep red liquid spreading across the ceremonial seat of Velarith authority, across the throne chair, pooling into the carved patterns of 3,000 years of royal history, while the High Consular who had opposed his niece's choice sat at the center of it. Blood on the throne. Not literal blood, not intentional, a service malfunction documented and explained in the incident log. But the image was real, and the room full of 37 civilizations had all seen it at the same moment, and in the particular, charged way that symbols attach to moments that are already loaded, it had landed like an omen. Not of violence, not of threat, of something older than those things. Of consequence. Of the sense, irrational, pre-logical, and somehow inescapable, that the universe had made a note of what had happened here, and was making sure everyone was paying attention. I wrote my final dispatch from the conclave that night. I've been a journalist for 11 years. I've filed dispatch from 32 star systems, 4 war zones, 9 peace negotiations, and 1 event that I still don't have adequate language for. I've learned to keep my own feelings out of the copy, because the story is not about me, and the reader doesn't need my feelings. They need the facts and the shape of what happened, and the context to understand why it matters. I mostly kept my feelings out of this dispatch. Mostly. 1 line near the end, I couldn't quite manage it. 1 line where what I'd watched for 3 weeks broke through the professional register, and said something I've been thinking about ever since. I wrote, "The galaxy has an old habit of confusing power with worth. This story is about the space between those 2 things and what lives there." My editor kept the line. I think she understood why it was there.